welcome to True Set Free. My name is Matt Lewis, and Pastor Steve is gone this week, so we have a special guest. I'll introduce her in a minute. If you have questions, you guys can send them to these places. Email me, crosswalkradio@gmail.com. If you're just watching Facebook or YouTube, you can, of course, post in the comments on social media. We'll try to get to them best we can. You guys can also voicemail or text me, 707-872-7677. For you guys that are local, I do have one announcement, and that is we're having a ministry conference in April. We're having Shane and Shane come down, which is really cool. Excited about that. But they're also going to do a live worship concert open to the community. So if you guys want to come to Shane and Shane, it's on April 29th at 7:30 p.m. here at Calvary Tri-Cities. And I'm being told that there's a limited number of tickets. So because of the size of our sanctuary and how popular these guys are as a Christian band, if you want to go, get your tickets now. So there's your warning for that and information. That's all I have. I can't remember if I've already said this, but Pastor Steve is gone. So we have with us here Tracy Tribbet. And a lot of you guys know her, especially if you're part of our fellowship and the battle that she's been fighting for us and other people of faith. But she's with PJI, Pacific Justice Institute. And I'll just have you introduce yourself, kind of tell them what you do. Let's just say somebody just tuned in, they've never met you before. Who are you?
So my name is Tracy, as Matt said, and I work for Pacific Justice Institute as their Washington staff attorney. So I handle their caseload here in Washington. Pacific Justice Institute was formed in the late 90s. It's a nonprofit, and we specialize in representing individuals who are facing persecution on behalf of their beliefs. So civil, religious liberties are our specialties, parents' rights, anything to do with your faith being suppressed and you being put in a position where you can't either speak freely. We've handled a lot of free speech cases, vaccine mandate cases, private schools being interfered with, parental rights, things of that nature, specifically when it has to do with your religious beliefs. So yes, that's PJI in a nutshell. We've got offices all over the states, about 18 to date. And so if you are tuning in from a state further afar than Washington, we can probably represent you wherever you find yourself in trouble.
Okay, so what that means is she specializes in civil liberties and religious freedom type cases. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. In that area, if you've been living under a rock and you don't know where this is going, those are the stuff that we're going to be talking about. But in the comments on social media, those are the questions to post. Okay, so my next door neighbor is mad at me and has a restraining order. It's not the legal type of questions we're going to answer, so just FYI. With that, I wanted to ask you, obviously, the last couple years, these situations have exploded.
Yeah.
Where has PGI started from and grown? You mentioned 18. Like, has that in the last 2 years doubled or stayed the same? Where's your growth and direction as far as what's going on with this stuff?
I'm not a mathematician, but I would say it's at least gone up 500%. When I came on board with PJI about 2 years ago, when all of this started, and I actually heard about PJI through a church service when Pastor Steve was talking about that organization. We had offices in, I want to say, Reno, or Nevada, Washington State, Oregon, California, and that was about it. There's quite a few different attorneys in California because that's where we originated from, but it was sparse. And now we're all over the West Coast, in the Midwest. We have quite a few offices, Florida, and it's interesting to see what kind of cases crop up for these types of issues, the civil religious liberties across the state. We've got blue states, red states, kind of a mix in between within the states. So yeah, it's seen expansive growth in the last 2 years alone.
Okay, so we got a lot to talk about, but what's cool, I just kind of want to tell this story because it was really a God thing. When this kicked off, obviously stuff was happening here at Calvary Chapel that my boss, Pastor Steve, had to deal with. And so he had me call PJI and get information on how to handle different things. And when I called, it was the Seattle office was what was on their website. and I can't remember who the Seattle
Jorge.
is the guy I talked to, and he goes, okay, here's the deal. You guys have a Tri-City rep down there. I'm like, we do. And so he gave me your number, and lo and behold, we had no idea, but Tracy was doing stuff over in our children's ministry and was part of our fellowship. So what an awesome thing to have, and she's blessed us tremendously going through this process, and we've been fighting battles you may know or may not know about, but it's been a total God thing, the way he organized it. So very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into it. I already see people posting stuff. This is my first one for you. Can you give us just a quick brief on the status of mandates and where we're heading in 2022? I do have stuff that if you don't answer it in that, I'll ask you, but we had a March 12th change,
Right.
and it seems to kind of, with the whole Russia thing, stuff has gone away, but where are we at
Yeah.
with the mandates, and then where do you see us going in the rest of this year and continuing?
Yeah, I think we went from seeing Fauci every day to
Right.
where is he? Where have they stuck him?
Amazing. The joke is that Putin cured COVID.
Yeah, indeed.
You know.
Shifting from one disaster to the next. So in Washington state, our governor had originally set the mask mandate to lift on March 21st. He backed down from that by about 9 days to the 12th, which was technically on Saturday, to remove the mask mandate, and that is in line with Oregon and California. They all kind of banded together. And it's interesting, if you look at the metrics of positive test cases, they're still just as high as they ever have been.
Really?
If you look at those metrics, at least the last week when I checked at it, because I wanted to see, is this reasonable in light of where the positive cases are at. And if you look at the metrics, it's still as high as it's ever been. And that's in light of them having closed 2 very high traffic testing sites in Seattle. There was actually an article, and I'm kind of doglegging, but I'll bring it back to the fairway in a minute. There was an article where the doctor who was in charge of the testing sites, multiple testing sites at the UW clinic, they would bring all the samples back. They were testing 5 samples at a time in one testing group. And so if one tested positive, they would all be marked positive. And then when the hype and hysteria started to get out of control, they determined that they needed to find a way to isolate the test so that they could individually determine who was testing positive and who was not. So you just see how these numbers may artificially be high still, and they always have been, at least based on what this doctor was saying. So terrifying indeed. But the mask mandate has gone away, so no one is required by the governor's order to wear a mask indoors, in schools. It's all been, the masks have come off. And it's interesting because there's a legal, theory or issue, and it's called capable of repetition yet evading review. And so the question on everyone's mind is he going to put the masks back on? When will that happen? What can we do? And, I think that over time, as people grow more comfortable with COVID, if you will, because there just has to reach that point where we're all understanding that we need to live with COVID. I think some of us have reached that tipping point sooner than others, where we will refuse to remask. The governor's other mandate, proclamation, I want to say 21.15, is still in effect, and that is the vaccine mandate. And I am hopeful that that will be lifted as well, so that hundreds, if not thousands, of workers in Washington state can get their jobs back. So as it stands today, the mask mandate has been lifted, but it is capable of being reinstituted as long as our governor keeps his powers, which he has and he is.
So let me ask you this. I tried to follow it, but there was this push to remove his emergency powers from unlimited to 30 days or something.
Right.
Did that pass, or is it pending? Do you know anything about that?
I know that there were multiple bills that were put forward. I don't know which ones made it how far, but I know that multiple ones were advanced, and they appeared to take away some of his power, but really all it was sort of a rubber stamp where he has to go back and get approval to do what he's been doing every 30, some bills said 60, and then 90 days. So I think one of those will go through. The problem, if you will, in Washington is that we are very much heavy. The scales of our political structure are very, very liberal. Right. And so if he does go back, he's going to get that authority, and it's not It's not going to be stripped from him. What would be great is at the municipal level, if local municipalities started finding ways to pass administrative codes or municipal codes that help to combat some of that. And that's where you take back that power, is at the local level. And it's been interesting to see how many other either municipalities or agencies have now taken emergency powers also. We saw this in a specific case that we'll get into later, but there is no end to the grasping of power and control that a lot of the agencies, governors, and different individuals are now taking it upon themselves to do.
So if I decode that correctly, are you saying that Benton County could adopt a ordinance that would now give at least our area a power to fight against whatever Inslee mandates for our stores and businesses?
Yes, more autonomy.
Okay.
What that would look like, I don't know. How far reaching, within a county it would go, or within a city. Again, you continue to peel back the layers and get more local control. The problem often becomes the carrot and the stick. If you don't take the carrot, then we'll give you the stick, and the stick would be taking away the money, the
Right.
state funds. And so that becomes an issue, long term, is the withholding of monies.
And the vaccine mandates that he still has in place, are those still under the emergency orders clause that
Yes.
he's using to keep those in place?
Yes.
So when he lifted the mask mandate, and you've already talked about how the numbers are not down, but he goes by the science.
Right.
If he's implementing powers, taking them away, goes to implement them again, doesn't that, with the numbers and the science of during those times, can't we use that against him to say, whoa, 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 you took it away with these numbers, now you're putting them back with the same numbers?
Right.
Or is it politics where he can just say whatever he wants? It's funny how all the numbers are not being talked about now. In fact, I saw one place where somebody, he mentioned the numbers and said, I can show them to you if you want. And then they said, yeah, show them to us. And he's like, well, never mind.
Yeah.
And so is it a case he's building up against himself, or can he just do this at will without actually having to prove that we need to do this?
Yeah. The numbers should be the truth. And
Right.
if they've been the truth, since the beginning, then it should continue to be the measure by which we judge, the actions that are taken. However, I will temper that by saying that in the courts, in a specific case that we had to try to get an injunction for some firefighters on the west side, even though there was a study published that showed that these individuals were not a risk if they were wearing masks or if they were tested, and these are firefighters, they didn't care. They did not care how safe they could create the environment. It was that second level of vaccination that had to be had. And so I think based on what we've seen is they can turn the numbers of the positive tests up or down depending on what they attribute the sickness to or the death. And so someone could die of COVID even though they had a heart attack. And
Right.
when you're able to play with those numbers, it creates a false sense of fear in people. And that's what I think our government, specifically Washington, has done. And so the numbers, they shouldn't lie, but they often do. And then it becomes, how much they can use the fear to play with the numbers. And you're right, those numbers, if you look at them and they're going down or they're staying up, then that should be able to be used against the governor at a later date. But it's within his emergency powers. And the courts have said this again and again. There are lawyers out there who have tried to challenge the governor's orders and his edicts and his movements and have had very little success because, again, our judiciary is also heavily weighted on the liberal side. And so when you're challenging his specifics, the governor's actions, you have to bring suit in Thurston County. You can't bring it anywhere else. And that's...
Which, if I had to say that plainly, is a county that he owns.
Yes, that's where Olympia is located. And so all the judges who've been appointed, et cetera, are very much going to bend towards erring on the side of caution with the government. And again, we're talking about government jobs specifically here. This is the public employment. And what this has done is removed a particular class of people from public employment. So now you no longer have Christians who are working in public employment. And the signal to the courts when you're looking at actions that are taken by employers, if you have a particular group of people that's been completely removed from employment and they're part of a protected class, that should be a sign or an indicia to the court to say, there's something going on here where this is having a disparate or a negative impact on a protected class of people. If you had a policy that was implemented that removed over 90% of individuals who were African American or individuals who were Muslim or something else, you would have a lot of complaints from society generally. But because it's Christians, we know that we're persecuted. We know that we're not looked on favorably by the world, and that's why there's so little traction legally to get people their jobs back.
That's a fascinating insight. I've never put that together. The fact that a lot of people have left because of their faith, and the mandates have been pushed. I have friend after friend after friend. Some of them have moved states. Some of them have just went into the private business or a place where it doesn't demand mandates. But look at what that's done to the entire group of faith-based community.
Yeah.
And I haven't even heard one outcry about it the way you just phrased it.
No. There's very little outcry because Christians are, bad people, etc., and they don't care about others and these choices that they're making. That's the narrative that is out there, which is absolutely untrue. And if you look by numbers, again, the numbers often don't tell the whole story. If you look at the number of unvaccinated individuals who tested positive and get into the meat of those numbers, it was not as high as it was articulated to be. It couldn't have been. Just based on sheer numbers, if you look at the census data and the number of positive tests and then the percentage of people who were vaccinated in Washington, there's no way that those numbers were correct. And so it's very sad thing for our state to have this many individuals who are faith-based removed from employment in the public works sector because the blessings of God go with the people. If you look at over the course of winter, all 4 of our major passes were closed because they had fired so many people from the Department of Transportation they couldn't get the roads cleared. And it was record snowfall in a short amount of time, but only like 1 or 2 inches over the record. It was not inordinate. And they closed all 4 passes for a great length of time. It was over a week, I think. So.
I'll put this up as you're talking. Hanson on here says, what does any of this have to do with religion, church, etc.? Why are we pitting the state against religious viewpoints and vice versa? Before it was what you just said, but and I'll just say my thing and you can say yours because you specialize in this. But Hanson, you have to understand that the majority of the community that we're talking about with this is faith-based religious exemptions against the mandates. Right. And then they went after churches, saying that you couldn't meet, you couldn't fellowship, you couldn't do the things that Scripture commands believers to do. And this is from the governor of our state under the protection that we have in a religious liberty. So the issues crossed over, and we're going to get into it. Public schools, churches, and the individual Christian in the United States of America protected under the Bill of Rights. So these issues have totally everything to do with the church and future persecution and things that we shouldn't shy away from. And then I'll let you say what you have to say.
If I'm understanding it correctly, where that intersects is that these individuals refuse to take the vaccine in their place of employment because of sincerely held religious beliefs, and that's protected activity. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and also in Washington under the Washington Law Against Discrimination, those exercising those rights are protected under particular circumstances, and particular groups are protected. So you've got anyone who's of an ethnic minority, gender in certain circumstances, and then faith-based individuals. You cannot discriminate against them. And a lot of the case law that was out there saying that vaccinations could be demanded in a workplace was before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You've got some cases dating back in Boston, and additionally with much higher death rates in the types of vaccines that were required. And generally you could opt out of it and then pay a fee or a fine. You didn't lose your job and lose your home. And this gets into the heart of the matter. A lot of individuals who work in state employment, they don't transfer jobs laterally. They can't just go and find another job where they're firefighters or policemen or things of that nature. It's not a job that's easily replaceable. And so you have individuals who are out on the streets, can't hold property anymore, had to move out of the state, as you mentioned earlier. And so where you're expressing your civil rights and you're removed from employment, that activates your rights under the law in Washington and at the federal level. And if every Christian individual were to assert a right and then be fired, that continuum will ensure that Christians can't buy, sell, trade and that, moves towards Revelation, the mark of the beast, and that's what we're trying to, at least in some regard, protect against, that people can assert their rights without fear of retaliation, losing their jobs, etc. Particularly when you've got science that says, a lot of the people requested an accommodation from the vaccine, meaning I won't get the vaccine, but I will wear a mask or I will test. That was what they were requesting, and those are proven to be effective. I mean, that's what the science says, right? That masking, whether or not we believe this now, but at the time, that was the truth, and that should be sufficient to not have to be vaccinated to lose your job.
And, I can't understand why believers can't make that connection, because like you pointed out, we know the end of the book. Mm-hmm. We know that there's a tyrannical leader mm-hmm. that is going to persecute Christians and groups of faith mm-hmm. using mandates. You can't buy, sell, and trade, and forcing them to do this. Mm-hmm. We see all this coming, and people are like, well, what does this have to do with Christianity? And I'm like, time out, dude. Mm-hmm. Are you kidding me? Like, how do we not understand what's going on here when we have the Spirit living inside of us?
Yes, amen. And it's, it's very generous and merciful of the Lord to give us these kinds of testings. They're difficult indeed, and people have a lot at stake here, but it's not the same kind of testing that will come in the tribulation. And if you can't see these things for what they are, then ask for eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to discern, because we now more than ever need to discern what is being asked of us as we are slowly eroding. Our rights are slowly being eroded, and if we don't stand up for it, it'll hurt a lot more the next time you have to say no. This, I would call COVID and even the churches shutting down sort of round 1, round 2, and each round gets harder and harder to part with the things of the world that you hold on to. So if, not everyone is convicted the same way, but if you've been convicted in a particular way by the Lord to not get vaccinated or do or not do something, you have to hold fast to what you're being asked to do by the Lord.
Yeah, and on top of that, and I wasn't planning to go down this road, but the issue with America, it's been it's been extensively used for the advancement of the gospel. Right. The freedom we've had, the freedom of speech, yes. The ability to take my Bible mm-hmm. and go and talk to somebody uninhibited. Mm-hmm. And I say this in the same time mm-hmm. where my friend, my brother mm-hmm. in Pakistan mm-hmm. just got arrested under their legal system. Right. Under the heresy law, mm-hmm. because he's preaching the gospel. Yeah. And it's against their law. So mm-hmm. he's thrown in prison. Right. Possibility of execution, right. And even if they don't, like the culture will just go after him and his family. Mm-hmm. If we have this bubble of freedom that promotes the ability to preach Jesus mm-hmm. and spread the gospel, right. Why wouldn't we defend that? Yeah. As people of faith, mm-hmm. so that we don't go to where even other places in the world are right now.
Yeah. America is the greatest country that has ever been, hopefully will ever be. And it's not because we're particularly astute or brilliant, or we have, we do have a lot of great things in America, but there are lots of other countries that do as well. It's because of God's blessing that falls upon us, because of the Christian traditions that we were founded upon. And if America falls, who will stand? Think about all of the mission work that comes out of America. You don't hear about a lot of African countries coming over here and doing mission work, or even out of Great Britain or other countries. America is the birthplace of mission work, really. Not birthplace, that's a stretch. It started long ago, but now, we're sort of the last remnant of a country that sends a lot of aid to a lot of other countries. And if our country goes down and we have no more civil liberties, where will other countries look to? Where will they flee? Where will people flee to when they have persecution? And we've got systems and means in place to help other countries and other people who are being persecuted. If that all goes by the wayside, it's a very dark day for the world indeed.
Yeah, and not just for the believer.
Yeah, everyone.
This affects everybody, whatever side that you get into, mm-hmm. when they just socially justice you out. Yep. Like, mm-hmm. Come on, dude, it's common sense. All right, to finish the thought on the last question of where we're going, I saw actually at PJI, get the emails or whatever, mm-hmm. California, and this was fascinating to me. Mm-hmm. they have switched from mask mandates to pushing vaccine mandate bills. The article I read is there's like 8 bills pending. Even though the courts have looked negatively about the vaccine mandates, there all this stuff coming down that for public schools and everything. Is that true? And why are they still continuing to do that?
I mean, there are, especially in California, there are mandates for vaccinations, even in Washington state. But here you can opt out of them through a form that you fill out on the Department of Health websites. But if you look at the, like they don't have the flu shot on there, and they have polio, measles, mumps, and rubella, things that have a 30% death rate, risk of death to children. And California, that really strikes a chord for a lot of people because they are not allowing doctors to opt people out. If that legislation is passed, they have taken and constricted individuals' rights to go to their doctor, to have people exempted. And there are a lot of people who have physical medical reactions to vaccines. Washington State has not followed suit in that, thank the Lord. They did not add that to the list this session of mandatory vaccines, but California has, and I think that probably will start to move its way north in Oregon and Washington, although again we do have the exemption option here for religious or medical reasons. The concern I have for doctors in Washington and other states is that if you give too many medical exemptions, they'll withhold your license. They do that in Washington and California already. They will withhold your license if you exempt 3 or more children from any vaccine. And so I think California is a lot more militant with, just by sheer numbers and volumes. And again, this is a populace and a people who are deathly afraid of COVID-19. If you don't know God, you're going to be afraid of everything.
Right.
If you know God, you just fear God.
For sure.
And everything else is kind of, background noise. But these are people who are trying to institute means and ways to avoid disease and viruses which naturally take their course. There are some things that you can definitely do, but this particular type of virus, they're going to have a very hard time controlling, as we have seen. And that vaccines, people who are vaccinated are still testing positive at very high numbers. And so it's not going to have the effect that they're looking for. And true vaccines, live virus vaccines, should have, the positive rates of COVID should be dropping precipitously, and that's not what we're seeing.
Yeah.
And if that's not, showing you whether or not something is effective, I don't know what is or what could.
Right. All right, let's change it up to another topic. I don't know why that came out wrong, but bring us up to speed on the private Christian school battle. And this is the rest of my question, in regards to what they're trying to do for policy and law. It appears they're getting nervous of the mass exodus from public school and are trying to strip the private schools from being able to make their own decisions. So we just had a meeting, our private Christian school here at Calvary had a meeting with the state on some of the stuff that's going on. Tell us, maybe in a nutshell, is that the case? Am I off? And where is this going for the private public schools?
Right.
Or for the private Christian schools.
Yeah,
faith-based
we actually got a lot of questions from private schools over the course of the year. And in Washington State, the private schools are governed by what's called the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education is a 14 board member group. 7 are elected by the governor, and then various other individuals who determine sort of minimum standards for education, graduation, things like that. And one of their other jobs or duties, if you will, is to kind of govern private schools, to make sure that they've got the right curriculums, that their buildings are safe. And if you read the code that gives the State Board of Education the authority to act, it speaks specifically to those things. Building up to code, what kind of materials they're using as far as general topics, that they have to cover to give a basic education to children. And that's what our legislature gave to them as authority. And what they attempted to do, similar, again, if somebody sees something that another person is doing, then they want to do it as well. The State Board of Education came up with emergency administrative codes, just like Rectal did with OSPI. That's our secretary over the public schools. So the State Board of Education implemented emergency administrative code that governs private schools, and they inserted some words into the code that already exists. So they gave themselves authority over personnel and practices and different words that were inserted that took their authority from just looking at these things in terms of building structure, fire safety code, things like that, and expanded it to cover the mask mandate, to cover employee-employer relations. And these things are done kind of in quiet, kind of, they're published, but who's going to read these things anyway?
Yeah.
Because they happen sort of subversively. And so at the beginning of the school year, they made one amendment, they made another one in December, and they started contacting all of the public schools to see where they were at on masking, likely in regard to complaints or just generally keeping tabs on people. And this came down, again, they modified the rule in August or September, and then again in December, because I think they saw that had some holes in how they drafted it, changed it, contacted Calvary Chapel to question about a bunch of things, policies and procedures. And at the beginning of the year, every private school has to sign an attestation that they're doing certain things, that everything is in accord with what the law says, and they sign that. And specifically in regards to the other laws that govern private schools. So the principal did that and sent it in, and that's sufficient. That's all she's required to do. But agency is very problematic. Agencies are the legislature creates them, and then they govern certain things. Like the Department of Health is its own agency. DSHS is its own agency, and so is the State Board of Education. And they are their own legislative body. They'll make up laws, like I just mentioned. They are their own executive branch. They've got heads who determine what happens procedurally, and then they're their own judicial arm as well. And so what you end up in front of an adjudicative officer who works for this agency. It's a complete conflict to begin with. In this scenario, we ended up with someone who is not a lawyer, so they had to have their lawyer from the Attorney General's office, and then we had the lawyer who represented a coworker of her, who was the one bringing the charges in this scenario. So you've got all these kinds of conflicts. And they had also helped in the drafting of the law, which was what we were discussing. So it's just massive conflict left and right. And they were attempting to start to govern things that are governed by the Department of Health and by Labor and Industries. And that's where, you really have to be careful in dealing with agency to make sure that they're within the purview of what they can govern you, and don't concede anything to them unless you have counsel or someone's helping you out. So needless to say, Calvary Chapel did not concede anything, and they dropped the charges completely against us based on, I think, the mask mandate, coming off, one, and then two, just the incestuous nature of the activities that were going on was enough to stop them and say, okay, we better back off of this and maybe come back later. The concern is that it's capable of repetition yet evading review. So if the masks go back on again, or if vaccines, they try to eventually add that in, what to do then? And, I'm not sure that I have the exact answer to that, other than to say you have to fight to ensure that the government isn't encroaching on areas and powers that they don't have, because they'll make it up,
No doubt. Is there any way out of this agency law black hole? Because if you didn't follow what Tracy was just saying, this, in my mind, in my world, the simpleton example I have is with the ATF.
Right.
So Second Amendment, Bill of Rights. They are alcohol, tobacco, and firearms.
Right.
And that's the short version. Now
Right.
they're the BATF or
Right.
whatever it is. But they will take a law, and whatever pops in my head, braces.
Right.
All right? And they will describe the legal words as they define them by the agency that enforces the position on that law.
Yeah.
So if you violate the gun brace law,
Right.
they come and arrest you. But they are the person who's defining and writing what those words mean,
Right.
and they change at whim.
Yeah.
So they go back and forth when there's a public outcry, and they fight like you just said. They go, oh, too much resistance,
Yeah.
and then they move over here. It's a total conflict of interest, and the problem is these agencies are a dime a dozen, and they're everywhere. Is there any hope to get out of this mess?
Agencies are a sham. I mean, they really are, and they just keep replicating. They don't stop, and the legislature gives them sort of a little wedge of authority to govern certain issues, and it ends up expanding and expanding. I think the best way to fight agency is to appeal it in superior court. In particular proceedings, you always have the right of appeal, and if you can get out of the administrative channels and get into Superior Court, you have a fairer chance of winning. And again, it has been my experience, every experience is different, but the more you give them, the more you're just giving them control. And then they turn around and you're trying to comply and do what you feel is right. And they, generally speaking, will just take that, build their case, because they don't have much of a case in general, and then just use it against you. So I would be very reticent to answer questions without legal counsel involved or do anything that they ask you to do. If you're approached by anyone, whether it's your children, or something for your business that governs your licensure, get legal counsel involved before you deal with them, because they're going to push on you to try to get you to give them the information they need, just like you would in a criminal proceeding.
Yeah.
I mean, there's different protections there, but they're going to try to push to get what they want so that they can build their case against you, whatever the subject matter is.
It's sad too, because we're obviously talking about religious freedoms and faith-based issues, but in the other agency law issues, if you're a private business, I don't know why I use myself in that, but
Right.
they don't. A lot of small businesses don't have the money to go hire these attorneys and
Right.
take on the government that's
Right.
harassing them over these little issues. So they either get disheartened,
Right.
don't do it, give up, quit and close, and like you said, because they're not willing to fight all the way, it's a downhill slide. Okay, so to finish off, there's a question with schools that we were talking about
Right.
that came up. What are the guidelines of the school buses? Someone posted on social media that their kid was kicked off the school bus for not wearing a mask. With the March 12th issue deadline there, or change that we talked about, how do buses fall into this? Do you know?
Right. Anything that's funded by the public schools fall under the governor's order. So that should not be being enforced. I would have to know the exact school and if they are, what they're trying to do with their policy. So it's hard to speak to the exact situation, but generally speaking, anything that falls under the governor's orders, which are publicly funded schools, they do not need to be masked up anymore. Kids, employees, etc. The mask mandate has gone away for the entirety of the state. Again, that doesn't mean at a local level that people can't try to enforce things more thoroughly than the governor is doing. I don't see that is likely to happen. As far as forcing people to wear masks, I think there would be a big backlash against that, but it sounds like that is what's happening. So I would definitely please reach out to PJI. We have a form you can fill out to give some more specifics, but that should not be happening, and that's an issue for sure.
All right, Mary Beth's on Facebook, and she asks, do the hospitals make money if you are declared COVID positive versus like a heart attack?
I believe so. I've seen, I couldn't cite to you, a specific, information from the federal government that says you get this, dollar amount, et cetera. But I think that there is a definite trend towards positive COVID cases, and I've heard that from personal stories. I've seen articles that did have proper cites to them, and it just was a big moneymaker because, again, our federal government had this huge package that they passed for people to get certain funds, but to get funds you have to qualify, or you have to have certain issues that happen. Dying from COVID is one of those that they earmarked for funds to go to different hospitals, and the hospitals were getting a lot of money. And if you test positive for COVID, it's just as easy to say, oh, yep, it was COVID, versus for COVID, it's just as easy to say it was a heart attack versus anything else. I mean, it doesn't even show anymore if you were vaccinated or unvaccinated. Generally speaking, they're not going to publish that. It'll just be dying from COVID. And I think what we've seen a lot of is, when you try to ease the burden and do something foolish, and I think we can all speak to this in our lives, like rush a vaccine, you have this reverberation afterwards. And now we're seeing that in the form of heart issues, and a lot of people who are having to go to the hospital with issues that have cropped up because they took the vaccine. So you're trying to save yourself in one regard, and then you end up harming your health in another regard. And I would be surprised if there weren't a ton of lawsuits based on injuries from the vaccines. And as more information comes out, I think everyone will be frightened by how quickly this was pushed and how unsafe and ineffective it was. But that's what the people were demanding and wanted, so they got it.
Can they the pharmaceutical companies protected against any kind of lawsuits?
There is a fund that they set up specifically for vaccine injury because, call it wisdom, call it what you want. They saw, okay, if everyone's getting harmed from these and these companies are getting sued for, millions, billions, whatever the number, they're going to stop producing these products. So we've got to set up a fund that everybody pays into that we can help these people who are injured get money out. And then you also keep it out of precedential case law. And
Right.
so when you're doing that, you're paying people out, but you can't find those cases. If you probably could, of who was paid what, but it's not going to be in case precedent showing who was harmed by what. There's so many stories of vaccine issues. Some people do fine with it. I was vaccinated when I was a kid. Aside from the occasional tick, I'm all right. But I think that over time that fund is going to drop precipitously, and they're going to have to put more funds in and pay into it.
All right, I have another one here for you. Is it legal for hospitals to turn you away if your children are not vaccinated?
That's the refusal of service, and hospitals, they don't have to employ an individual who's unvaccinated, but to refuse service on the basis of your protected status, if you've got a religious exemption, especially in life-threatening situations, no, and that's worth pursuing, particularly as time goes on. I think the hype is wearing thin, and hospitals are literally there to save lives and to treat people, and when they're refusing to do that, that's where you get into torts and negligence and things of that nature that I think hospitals would be well advised to avoid. And again, in particular, masking, testing, things of that nature, they have been federally funded to have all these things on hand so they can take precautions to make sure if you're coming in unvaccinated that you're not testing positive or that you have to wear a mask. And, as offensive as that may be, those are masking and testing is, the reasonable accommodation. It would be impossible to go in front of a court and say masking and testing right now are not reasonable. Over time, that may be found to be untrue. A lot of individuals who were granted a religious exemption, particularly teachers, that was one of the few unions that I saw who vied for individuals to keep their jobs while being unvaccinated. Well, now they've still got to wear their masks. And then, they're basically having to tell people, it's compelled speech of having to say, I'm not vaccinated, etc. The opposite argument would be, well, no, some people just prefer to wear a mask, but that's generally not the case.
Yeah.
So I think that you will see some litigation crop up in that regard, whether or not it's compelled speech or not, having to give medical information that you otherwise would not reveal.
Okay, so I just flew for the first time, which means I'm going through an airport, which is federal.
Yes.
Let me rephrase that. I've flown before. First time since the
Right.
2020 crazy.
Right.
And I knew what was going on, and I knew they were going to be militant. But I'll tell you what, by the time I got back flying through SeaTac, every 15 minutes there's an announcement. And it used to be like, don't give your bags to terrorists type of
Right,
thing.
right.
And now it's like, wear your mask,
mask on.
make sure it's above your nose. This is a federal offense.
Right.
If you say anything to the flight attendant, you will be prosecuted.
Yep.
Persecuted.
Both.
And I'm just like, it was really hard for me.
Yeah.
I'll just leave my soapbox there.
I think it's very interesting if you look at the FCC. You had Southwest where they were refusing to be vaccinated, and they were
Right.
gonna, the pilots were gonna walk. And I think it's interesting. Like, no one has been harsher than the FCC and the airlines. But then also they backed up quick off of the vaccine mandates. I didn't see that one coming. I did
Yeah.
not think it would be the airlines.
So that was where I was going with my question.
Yeah.
Is Biden said something about federal mask mandates, whatever, continuing or going away?
I don't know. I haven't heard, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
I just assumed he probably would continue them. My bad.
Well, is the airports, the FCC, going to, under federal law, continue on even though the states are starting to change?
They
Or
would,
what do you?
they would have to get a law passed to give them that authority. Right now, if it's under the president's mandate to have them masked, then once that goes away, they don't have authority without specifically passing either legislation to give the FCC that right, or individual companies determining their own policies. And I think the big worry for the airlines is getting shut down again. I mean, that crippled them. Those companies having to, or not being able to fly, people being scared of flying. And so I think it's more about their bottom line and their numbers, because they don't want the numbers to go up because of people continuing to fly and then have an outbreak and have to shut down the airlines again because they'll go for broke. I mean, there's just no way to bail them out of that. So they're super militant about keeping masks on. They'd like to continue it, I think, into the forever future.
Great. I remember
I don't know. But
it was from the State of the Union speech that Biden alluded to dropping some of the mandates, but I can't remember the date that was with it. So
right.
Okay. My next one for you is from Official Facts Checker on YouTube. I just post the YouTube names, and some of them are hilarious. So they say, does your organization exclusively support Christians, or is it all religions, all faiths?
Yeah, all religions. I think that we trend more towards Christians, but we've had some clients who are Muslim faith, Jewish, and technically, by legal standards, any religion, is a religion. If you assert to yourself that you have particular beliefs, and I saw that with some of the vaccine mandates, individuals who just adhered to sort of, their own thing, were able to, get granted an accommodation. Whether or not they kept their job, different story. And that was the interesting thing with the mandate, was that our governor allowed for exemptions from the vaccine, but none of the employers implemented it that way. They said, okay, we're going to grant you, we see that you have a sincerely held religious belief, we're going to grant you an exemption, but we cannot accommodate you. And it's just that, lawyerly wording where they're able to say it would be an undue burden. And that standard is very low. You can chalk it up to cost, to danger to other people, things of that nature.
So we were discussing this a minute ago, but can you help us understand the difference between federal law and mandates, and then how specific states can also be different in these regards? So we talked about this a little bit, but I'd really like you to explain to just the normal Joe who doesn't know legalese, Christian, what the federal government, president, and all those powers are doing versus what our local governor is doing. And then what's the difference between, because when the governor says, I decree that you do this, a law-abiding citizen is like, well, I have to do it. But there's a difference between a law and a mandate, and a lot of people, including myself, get confused on, where's the legal authority here? Am I going to get in trouble? Can I disregard this? Is there any way for you to simplify this for us?
Who's on first, kind of a... So at the federal level, if you think of it in layers, you've got all the states and they have individually marked territories. And then the federal government sort of lays over the top of that and expands across the United States. And as far as, authority, and we call it jurisdiction, but, it's the authority of law and where it holds sway. And so the president has the authority to govern those who get federal funds for federal purposes. And so Hanford is an example out here. You have a lot of contractors who get money from the federal government for Hanford, and then the site is owned by the federal government. So that's what's controlling for Hanford. And then you also have the fact that it's on state lands, although they've been appropriated to the federal government. And that Hanford is controlled exclusively by federal mandate. And that, because if you think about it, if not, then our governor could come in and he could control what's going on at Hanford. And anywhere that there was a nuke site, then any governor could come in and start to control what was going on there. And that's not what they want.
Right.
Federal government has to maintain control. And then you also talk about federal questions of law. If you're going to go to court, you can go to federal court or you can go to state court. If you're in federal court, it has to be a question of federal law. So that would be, in the example I gave earlier, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's a federal law that was passed. It applies to the states, but the state laws, the Washington Law Against Discrimination, doesn't apply to necessarily the federal government. It would only have the Civil Rights Act apply to it in terms of discrimination. So if you were discriminated against and you were a federal employee, I wouldn't go into federal court and bring a state law claim. They don't want to exercise jurisdiction over that. And so there was a lot of back and forth. There's different circuits in the federal court system. And so you had the Second and Fifth Circuit were enjoining or stopping the president from doing certain things, or different employers, which would enjoin them federally from doing that unless they appealed it to the Supreme Court. And a lot of people were thinking, okay, well, does that apply here? Well, no, not necessarily. It can apply differently in a different circuit. So the Ninth Circuit, our circuit, is very liberal. They interpret things very differently than some of the other more conservative circuits. And that's why you have all those circuits reporting to the Supreme Court. In our state, the governor controls what, I think we've all found out a lot more about our governor than we than we care to know, and didn't realize how much power he had. But again, those powers are vested by our legislature, who gives him his power. I think when they made the laws for emergency situations, they did not foresee this. I think, in hindsight, a lot of people would have voted differently on this particular bill, giving our governor the authority he has. And so if you have a question of state law, like state laws or happenings that go on in a state, you can bring that in state court. And I know I'm speaking more to court than I am to federal, but it's the territory and the type of law that you're talking about. So as a general matter, if you're a Christian and you're wondering, do I follow these things? What do I do? Look to the authority that the person has. Look to the intent. The legislative intent behind creating the governor's authority was in case of a natural disaster. We've got a mudslide here. We've got to allocate funds to get these people unearthed and get their town back in order. And arguably a pandemic, is a natural disaster. But it's a length of time. How long does it go on for? At what point is it encroaching into my personal life? And does the governor have the right to tell me what I do in my home? Does he, as an individual citizen, have the right to govern certain aspects of my life? And that's that jurisdictional idea. The Department of Health can tell people what has to do with health. Labor and Industries can tell employers, what to do with their employees. And the governor can only go into those relationships so far. He can't tell private businesses, what to do. And we saw him back up from that initially. He was, contemplating certain businesses over certain size were going to have to vaccinate, etc. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question. I think I've kind of gone off track. But if you are wondering whether or not you have to obey a law, look to what gives that person the right to tell you what to do. If you walk down the street, your parent has the right to tell, their child what to do. Another adult doesn't necessarily have the right to tell a child what to do if they have no authority over them. So that's the key.
And then, Tracy just talked everything about governing authorities. If you're a Christian, your number one authority is the Lord and His Word. So regardless of whoever is making those claims, those laws, those mandates, whatever it is, if the governor says you can't go to church, or you can't worship, or all the other things that have come up the last couple of years, the answer for the Christian is a hard no.
Right.
And some of this stuff is, I think, by nature, Christians want to be at peace with all men as much as possible. But there is a line that, in my opinion, has been crossed by churches, by people of faith, that has allowed the obedience to the Lord to be trumped in trying to make peace with men. And Jesus couldn't do it. The apostles couldn't do it. I don't know why we think we can do it.
Absolutely. Ultimately you answer to Jesus for what you do or don't do. And if this is, again, marching towards that mark of the beast in Revelation, eventually they're going to tell you what you can and cannot do. And this is a merciful testing from the Lord that is kind of like a velvet hammer. It's harsh, but it's not what it could be and what it will be in the future. So anything that interrupts or interferes with your rights to exercise your religious liberty, that's where the line that the government can't cross. Now, again, in the employment context, that ended up working out a little differently because you don't necessarily have a constitutional right to that job. And that's where that, line sort of in the sand. We haven't had a lot of luck in challenging the vaccine mandates because, as far as injunctions go, because you can be repaid for those kinds of actions with damages. And that's the defense as well. You can get damages later. So this isn't something that we're going to enjoin right now. Enjoin means to just stop an activity, to order people back to work.
Okay, I have this one up here. What can the average Christian, the average American citizen do in the fight that we're in? And specifically, to help make a difference in the area of protecting our civil liberties that directly tie in our ability, like we talked about at the beginning of the show, to spread the gospel, to meet as Christians, to take our kids into private school, the reason that we're doing that, and I'll just say this, we've exploded.
Right.
And the private, and it's not just Christians wanting to go, oh, I want to go to the private Christian school because I'm a Christian. No, it is people from the world.
Right.
A lot of non-believers ripping their kids out of public school because of the sex ed bills, because of obviously the mandates, and it affects secular and Christian alike. But what can we do to stand against it just as the average Joe person? Maybe I have a business, maybe I'm a teacher, maybe I'm a cop,
Right.
whatever it is. As an attorney, and then the law, the legal place,
Right.
that's a place that we want to fight.
Right.
No one wants to pick up a musket and do it the hard way.
Right.
What do you tell people in your expertise and what you see?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, if you're a Christian, you're not average. You might be an average American, but you're definitely not average if you're a Christian. And you have, you should have the fear and the boldness of God inside of you. And I think that this has been a wake-up call for a lot of us, that we need to take stands. We need to know what our boundary lines are, what we will allow the government to tell us and not tell us. If you're a business, you're going to have certain parameters you have to function within. And I think a lot of people saw this in the context of operations. There were a lot of businesses in the Tri-Cities that remained open and continued and persevered. You can always challenge what the government's doing. That doesn't guarantee that you're going to win, but it doesn't matter if you win here on earth. We know we're not going to. It matters of what kind of stand you're taking for Christ. And you can do that in the right spirit. That takes prayer to assert rights with the right mindset, with the right heart space. I think a lot of us, as these things, what we have to watch and guard ourselves against is a feeling of self-righteousness as all this nonsense begins to unfold, as we see people who are harmed by the vaccines, as the mask mandates go away and the numbers are still high. There's, the impetus is going to be to do the I told you so thing. But not doing that and turning the other cheek in that circumstance is saying, that was hard for everyone. Glad we made it through that. In your business, respecting that other people who don't know God are going to fear these things and they're going to continue to fear these things. And now that the box has been opened, who knows what biological warfare weapons are going to continue to be released. And I think taking that strong stand that, you're not fearful, posting scripture in your business, just having a general walk with the Lord that people can see. And most of us Christians, we're isolated in bubbles where we only deal with other Christians. Our time and contact with the outside world is limited, whereas if you're a business owner that deals generally in the public, or I don't deal with a lot of Christians other than my clients in the court system, that's more about how you respond to people when they're accusing you. When all of this came out, we were mocked for not believing the science and not acting in accord with what man says and what man says to fear. So the average American is going to, be very angry about these things. The Christian, as all of you are, needs to have the right mindset about it going forward, because it likely will come back again. And then the stance that you take is, am I going to mask up again, or am I going to fight it? And obviously PJI is here to assist you in any way we can. There is no magic bullet around any of this, other than to say, if we can look back in hindsight, we can use what's been done to show going forward that natural immunity, I think that argument will become a better argument for businesses, and that you can have natural immunity tests for your employees, or give people the option to have a mask or not have a mask. Let people, employees in particular, have religious exemptions or medical exemptions to masking or to other mandates as they come forward, and try to operate and live your business in the truth that Jesus speaks to you, whatever he's speaking in particular to you. Some of us have, myself included, more of a type A personality where I don't want to obey anything, and I've had to do some humbling there. Other people, God is calling you to stand up when you would rather not. And each of us, he's working that out day in, and I've seen that, and we're all called to do something great while we're here. Your greatness may be that you have to sit down and put on a mask, and that's a great thing for you, because it's hard for you. Everyone's a little bit different, and your job, if you have to do that, is your accommodation, and you have to be still in that, and that's a difficult thing. If that's what the Lord's calling you to do. That doesn't mean I'm not here to fight for you and with you alongside, but ultimately it's what the Lord is telling you to do. That is what you have to do.
All great points. I took flack from Christians. A few conversations I got into in the beginning when it was 2 weeks to spread the curve.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
I don't know.
this doesn't pass the smell test.
Right.
Do you know where this can go? Oh, there you go with your tinfoil hat ideas
Yeah.
again and conspiracy theory.
Completely.
And,
Completely.
if
Yeah,
the Lord...
the truth. I mean, the truth is now coming out.
Yep. Okay. I want to, we're out of time, but I want to end it with this. Not to put you on the spot, but, and I should have typed this out while you're talking. I'll throw this up here in a minute. I want to ask you, in the 2-year stuff that you in, the fight that you've been in the legal system, obviously some of the stuff can be negative, and the purpose of this show is to get knowledge to people who don't understand, and so we had to talk about the issues.
Right.
But it can be disheartening, and I understand that. So what cool things have the Lord done in the last couple of years that you've seen in the faith-based fight? And then I'm going to, on the second part of this, just ask you to tell people, and I'm not trying to add to your workload. I know that you're swamped and it's been crazy and stuff, but just tell them how they can find you, whether it's PJI or whatever, and then if they want to contribute, support, I'll have you tell them that as well.
Awesome. I'll start with the last part first so I don't forget.
Okay.
PJI, the website, I believe, is pji.org or Pacific Justice Institute if you Google it. We are a 501c3, so if you do want to make a donation, it is tax deductible. We offer our legal services free of charge. We operate strictly by donation, and so to engage our services, it's $1 because you have to have a binding contract and have offer acceptance and agreement. And so the kinds of cases that we're able to provide, it's not just individuals who can afford it, it's everyone. And that's, I think, as Christ would have it. It's, from the lowly to the high and lofty, everyone gets the same treatment at PJI. And yes, we have been swamped for sure, but we're always trying to help. And we're strategically trying to take on specific cases with specific issues to help undo some of the burden of the last couple years. So while injunctions haven't been particularly successful, we've got some other cases that I think will help us in the future. And the most amazing thing that has come out of this, as you would suspect in any hardship, is the growing of people's faith. A lot of people, I think a lot of us, we're walking in a lukewarm fashion. And now I see people who are on fire, who anyone may have even known that they were a Christian before this. And so getting to see the individuals who, even if you're not getting your jobs back, maybe that wasn't God's design for you, but your faith is growing. You have been tested and you come out the other side stronger in your faith. That's the point. We don't need to hold on very tightly to what we have here. Whatever it is that you've been asked to let go of through the pandemic, God has better for you on the other side. And the Lord is testing you in a very generous way in order to see where you might have weaknesses, where the your testing points might need some assistance, and to grow in faith, that might need some assistance. That has been a tremendous thing. Specifically with cases, we've seen some great freedom of speech cases that happened in Olympia. We had one where the prosecutor dismissed the case entirely. That has never happened. I've never seen prosecutors back down. So that was amazing. Calvary Chapel, we had a big win there when they dropped the charges against the private school. And just a lot of things that can get handled at the lower level, even if we're not seeing a lot of traction at the Supreme Court level, whether state or federal. There are things coming. That stuff just takes time, and patience and perseverance is the key for any of you in your walk and what's going on with your jobs. Consider yourself blessed for the trials that you're enduring. Read the book of James if you need a reminder.
Amen. All right, great place to add. Thanks for coming on. Appreciate you giving us some updates, and I'm sure stuff's going to change. We'll try to have you on again if something major comes up to inform people. But pray for her and the battle that she's fighting. It's at the front of the lines, and so we appreciate you. Yeah, and until next time.
Thanks.
For you guys that are local, if you have questions, send them to me, please. You can email me crosswalkradio@gmail.com. You guys can leave a voicemail or text me 707-872-7677. Wednesday at 3:30 is our program. We have a couple more guest speakers as Pastor Steve's gone the next week or so. So look forward to there. We'll post the topics of the shows that are coming up. And